The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield as I drove through the narrow, winding roads that led to the old manor on the outskirts of town. My name is Detective Tom Vickers, and I'd been hired to investigate a string of mysterious deaths that had the town buzzing with gossip and fear. Each victim had been a wealthy man, found dead under peculiar circumstances, and each one was married to the same woman, Marlene Davenport, the infamous Black Widow. The case had been handed to me by a desperate attorney representing the families of the deceased men. They believed that Marlene, with her delicate features and disarming charm, was far from innocent. But there wasn't a shred of hard evidence to tie her to the deaths, just whispers and suspicions. As I parked in front of the grandiose mansion, I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl up my spine. The house itself seemed to loom over me, dark and foreboding, as if it were alive and aware of my presence. I shook off the feeling and made my way to the front door. Before I could knock, the door creaked open, and there she stood. Marlene Davenport was every bit as beautiful as they said, tall and slender, with raven black hair that cascaded down her shoulders. Her eyes were a deep, piercing blue, like the ocean just before a storm. She smiled warmly at me, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. "Detective Vickers, I presume. Please come in. I've been expecting you." Her voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, as she led me inside. The interior of the house was just as unsettling as its exterior dark wood paneling, heavy drapes that blocked out most of the light, and the faint scent of something sweet and cloying that I couldn't identify. As she guided me into a sitting room, I noticed a portrait hanging on the wall. It was of Marlene, standing beside a man who I recognized as one of the deceased husbands. They looked happy, too happy, considering the man had died just months after the painting was completed. Marlene gestured for me to sit, and I did, feeling the weight of her gaze on me the entire time. "I understand you're here to ask me some questions, Detective," she said, her smile never wavering. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm investigating the deaths of your former husbands. There are some inconsistencies in the reports, and I'm hoping you can help clarify a few things." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs as she studied me. "Of course, Detective. I'll do whatever I can to assist, but I assure you, I've done nothing wrong." The way she said it with such confidence sent a shiver down my spine, but I pressed on, pulling out my notebook and pen. "Your first husband, Richard Davenport, died of what was ruled a heart attack, but there were traces of a rare toxin found in his system, something that wasn't listed in the initial autopsy." Marlene's expression didn't change, but I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around the armrest of her chair. "Yes, that was a terrible time for me. Richard was the love of my life, but the doctors assured me it was natural causes. And your second husband, Peter Collins," I continued, "drowned in your pool. Yet there were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that he had even tried to save himself. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" She sighed softly, her eyes downcast. "Peter had been drinking heavily that night. I've always believed it was a tragic accident. I could feel the tension in the room thickening, the air growing colder despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Something wasn't right here. I felt like I was being drawn into a web, a trap that I couldn't see. "There's one more thing, Mrs. Davenport," I said, my voice betraying my unease. "Your last husband, Robert Michaels, was found dead in his study. The cause of death was listed as a stroke, but there were no prior indications of any health issues. And there was a note found on his desk, addressed to you." Marlene's eyes snapped up to meet mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something fear, or maybe anger. "What note?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a photocopy of the note, unfolding it slowly. It says, "Forgive me, Marlene, but I can't go on like this. I know what you've done." The room seemed to grow darker, the fire dimming as if snuffed out by an unseen force. Marlene didn't say anything, but her gaze locked onto the note, her hands trembling slightly. "That's not his handwriting," she finally said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Are you sure?" I pressed, feeling my heart pound in my chest. "Absolutely," she replied, her eyes narrowing as she looked back at me. "Someone is trying to frame me, Detective, and if you're not careful, you'll end up just like them." The threat hung in the air between us, heavy and ominous. I knew I was in deep now, deeper than I had ever been in any case before. And as I left the house that night, the rain still pouring down like a curtain of black, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. I wasn't hunting a murderer, I was being hunted by one. Sleep eluded me that night. Marlene's warning echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the puzzle. Each husband had died under strange circumstances, and though the evidence was circumstantial, the coincidences were too glaring to ignore. I needed to dig deeper, to find the thread that connected them all. The next morning I headed to the local library to comb through the archives. I needed to know more about Marlene Davenport, her past, and the men she had left in her wake. The librarian, a kind woman in her 60s, showed me to the microfilm machine and handed me a stack of newspapers. "There's been a lot of talk about her lately," she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "People say she's cursed." "Cursed?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," she continued, nodding gravely. "Every man who marries her ends up dead. They say it's not just bad luck, it's something darker." I thanked her and settled in front of the machine, feeding in the first reel. As the images flickered to life on the screen, I began scrolling through old headlines. Each one was like a ghost, a whisper of the lives that had been lost. Wealthy businessman found dead in mansion pool. Local philanthropist dies suddenly. Prominent lawyer passes away in sleep. All of them linked to Marlene. But it was an article from nearly 20 years ago that caught my eye. "Young bride dies in freak accident on wedding night," the headline read. The bride's name, Emily Davenport, Marlene's younger sister. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I read the details. Emily had fallen down a flight of stairs in the very house where Marlene now lived. Her death had been ruled an accident, but the article mentioned that she had been found at the bottom of the stairs in her wedding dress, her neck broken. It was then that I noticed something strange. The article mentioned that Marlene had been staying with her sister at the time, helping with wedding preparations. But there was no mention of the groom. His name had been conspicuously left out. I scribbled down a note to follow up on this later. As I continued searching, I found another article, this one from just a few years ago. It detailed the death of Marlene's father, Harold Davenport, a wealthy real estate mogul who had died of a sudden heart attack. The piece mentioned that he had been in the process of changing his will to leave everything to Marlene. The change had been finalized just days before his death, and the other heirs, Marlene's estranged brother Shad, contested it in court, claiming foul play. They lost the case due to lack of evidence. My gut told me this wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. There was a pattern here, a method to the madness. Marlene wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a calculating predator, weaving a web of death around those closest to her. I left the library with a knot in my stomach and headed to the police station to check on the toxicology reports for Richard Davenport, Marlene's first husband. When I arrived, Officer Barnes, an old friend of mine, greeted me with a grim expression. "Tom, you're not going to believe this," he said, pulling me into his office. "What's up?" I asked, closing the door behind me. Barnes handed me a file, his hand shaking slightly. "We reran the tests on Davenport's blood sample, like you asked. The results came back positive for aconite." "Aconite?" I repeated, my heart skipping a beat. "Isn't that wolfsbane?" Barnes finished for me. "It's a highly toxic plant, used in small doses as a poison. But here's the kicker, we couldn't figure out how it got into his system. There were no signs of it in the food or drink found in the house." A cold dread settled in my gut. How is that possible? Barnes shook his head. "I don't know, Tom, but there's something else. I pulled the records from the other deaths connected to Marlene Davenport. Every single one of them has traces of some obscure toxin or poison in their system, something that would be hard to detect unless you were specifically looking for it." My mind raced as I tried to process the information. If what Barnes was saying was true, then Marlene was far more dangerous than I had imagined. She was meticulous, careful not to leave any trace of her involvement, but she had slipped up just enough for me to catch the scent. "There's more," Barnes added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I looked into the note you found in Robert Michael's study. You're right, it's not his handwriting. We compared it to samples from his personal letters, and the note is a match for Marlene's handwriting." I felt a surge of triumph mixed with fear. I had her. But at the same time, the realization hit me that I was dealing with someone who wouldn't hesitate to kill again if she felt threatened. "What are you going to do, Tom?" Barnes asked, concern etched on his face. "I'm going to confront her," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "But I need to be smart about it. I can't let her know I'm onto her, at least not yet." Barnes nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Be careful, Tom. She's dangerous." "I will," I assured him, though deep down I wasn't so sure. As I left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every passerby's glance lingered too long. I drove back to my apartment, my mind racing with plans and contingencies. I needed to catch Marlene in the act, to find irrefutable evidence that she was behind the murders. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The silence of my apartment felt oppressive, the darkness too thick. I kept the lights on, telling myself it was to help me think. But in truth, I was afraid that Marlene knew I was closing in, afraid that she would strike before I could stop her. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside my window, a soft scraping sound like nails on glass. My heart pounded as I grabbed my gun and approached the window, my hand trembling slightly. I peered through the curtains, expecting to see some shadowy figure lurking outside. But there was nothing, just the wind rustling the leaves and the distant hum of the city. I let out a shaky breath and backed away from the window, trying to convince myself that it was just my nerves getting the better of me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that the Black Widow had spun her web tighter around me, and it was only a matter of time before she made her move. The morning sun felt more like a weak flicker than a source of warmth. My nerves were shot from the restless night, my mind plagued by thoughts of Marlene and the invisible web tightening around me. I had to move quickly but carefully. One wrong step, and I'd end up just like the others. I spent the day gathering what I needed for the final confrontation. First, I visited a contact I had at the district attorney's office, someone who could expedite a search warrant. With the new toxicology reports and the note matching Marlene's handwriting, I had enough to justify a search of her mansion. But I knew that Marlene was cunning. I needed to catch her in the act, or she'd slip through my fingers once again. As I left the DA's office, I felt a nagging sense of urgency gnawing at my gut. I decided to take a detour to visit the last living relative of Robert Michaels, his sister Ellen. She had been estranged from him for years, but had reappeared after his death to settle his affairs. If anyone knew more about the circumstances leading up to Robert's death, it might be her. Ellen's home was modest, a stark contrast to the opulence of Marlene's estate. She answered the door with a wary expression, her eyes narrowing when she saw my badge. "I've already told the police everything I know," she said, crossing her arms defensively. "I'm not here to ask you to repeat yourself," I assured her, keeping my tone gentle. "I just need to know if Robert ever mentioned anything unusual about Marlene before he died. Anything at all." Ellen hesitated, her gaze shifting to the floor. "Robert and I weren't close, but he did call me a few days before he passed. He sounded different, nervous, like he was hiding something. He said he had discovered something about Marlene, something that scared him." My pulse quickened. "Did he say what it was?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "He just kept saying he was sorry, that he wished he had been a better brother. I thought he was being melodramatic, but now—" She trailed off, her voice cracking with emotion. I felt a pang of guilt for pressing her, but I couldn't let this lead slip away. "Ellen, I think your brother was onto something," I said softly. "Something dangerous. If there's anything else you can remember, it could help me stop her." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with fear. "There was one other thing. He mentioned a key. He said it was the key to everything, but he didn't explain what he meant. I found a key in his study after he died, but it didn't fit any of the locks in his house." "A key," I repeated, intrigued. "Do you still have it?" Ellen nodded and disappeared into the house for a moment, returning with a small, ornate key. It looked old, with intricate designs etched into the metal. I turned it over in my hands, trying to imagine what it might unlock. It was too small for a door, but perhaps it belonged to a lockbox or a safe, something Robert had hidden away. "Thank you, Ellen," I said, tucking the key into my pocket. "This could be important." She nodded, her expression grim. "Please, Detective, don't let her get away with this." I left her house with a renewed sense of purpose. The key was a tangible clue, something that could lead me to the evidence I needed. But time was running out. I knew I had to confront Marlene soon before she had a chance to strike again. As the day slipped into evening, I received a call from Officer Barnes. The search warrant had been approved. It was time to make my move. I drove to Marlene Mansion, the key heavy in my pocket like a ticking clock. I parked a few blocks away and made my way to the estate on foot, taking the back roads to avoid drawing attention. The air was thick with tension, the night unnaturally quiet. As I approached the house, I saw the faint glow of lights through the heavy drapes. The house seemed alive, pulsing with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. I circled around to the back entrance, using the cover of darkness to remain unseen. I tested the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I stepped inside, my senses on high alert. The house was eerily silent, the only sound my own footsteps echoing on the marble floors. I moved through the rooms like a shadow, avoiding the pools of light cast by the ornate chandeliers. I needed to find the source of Marlene power, the secret she had been hiding from everyone, including her victims. My instincts led me to the study, a room I had only briefly seen on my first visit. The heavy wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a room filled with rich dark furniture and shelves lined with books. A large desk dominated the space, and behind it, a portrait of Marlene hung on the wall, her eyes following me as I entered. I walked to the desk and began searching through the drawers, careful not to disturb anything that would alert Marlene to my presence. I found nothing but papers, all meticulously organized. Then I noticed something odd. The carpet beneath the desk had a slight bulge, as if something was hidden underneath. I crouched down and lifted the edge of the carpet, revealing a small trapdoor set into the floor. My heart raced as I inserted the key Ellen had given me into the lock. It clicked open with a satisfying sound. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the latch. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever was down there could either be the evidence I needed or a trap waiting to spring. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. Beneath the trapdoor was a small, dusty compartment, just large enough to hold a single item. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked with age. I reached in and pulled it out, the pages yellowed and brittle. As I flipped through the journal, my eyes widened in shock. The pages were filled with detailed accounts of the deaths each husband, each carefully planned murder. The handwriting was unmistakably Marlene. She had documented everything, from the poison she had used to the manipulations that had driven her victims to their deaths. It was a confession in her own hand, hidden away like a twisted trophy. My hands shook as I realized the gravity of what I had found. This was the evidence I needed to bring her down. But before I could process it, I heard the faintest creak of a floorboard behind me. I spun around, but it was too late. Marlene stood in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. Her eyes locked onto the journal in my hands, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or regret. But it was quickly replaced by a chilling calm. "So, you found it," she said, her voice low and menacing. "I wondered when you would." My mind raced, searching for a way out. The door was blocked, and I had no doubt she had a weapon hidden somewhere on her. I tried to stall, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "It's over, Marlene," I said, holding up the journal. "I've got all the evidence I need to put you away for life." She smiled, a slow, predatory grin that made my blood run cold. "You're mistaken, Detective. This isn't over, it's only just beginning." Before I could react, she lunged at me, a gleaming knife flashing in the dim light. I barely had time to dodge as the blade sliced through the air, narrowly missing my throat. I stumbled back, trying to regain my footing, but she was on me in an instant, her movements swift and deadly. We struggled, the journal slipping from my grasp and falling to the floor. Marlene was strong, stronger than I had anticipated. I could see the cold determination in her eyes. She had killed before, and she would kill again without hesitation. But I wasn't about to let her win. I managed to twist out of her grip and landed a solid punch to her midsection, knocking the wind out of her. She gasped, doubling over, and I seized the opportunity to grab the knife from her hand. I held it up, the blade gleaming in the dim light. "Stay back," I warned, my voice harsh with the adrenaline pumping through my veins. But Marlene didn't back down. She straightened up, her expression darkening, and took a step toward me, her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "You're not leaving this house alive, Detective," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the darkness pressing in. I knew I had to act quickly. This was a fight to the death, and only one of us would walk away. With a surge of strength, I lunged at her, the knife aimed for her chest, but she was quick, sidestepping my attack and delivering a sharp blow to my ribs. The pain was blinding, but I fought through it, swinging the knife again and again as we circled each other like animals in a cage. The struggle was fierce, every move a desperate attempt to survive. But finally, with a swift, decisive strike, I drove the knife into Marlene's side. She let out a sharp gasp, her eyes widening in shock as she... Marlene's gasp echoed through the room, a sound that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. Her eyes, wide with shock and pain, locked onto mine, and for a fleeting moment I saw the woman behind the mask, the vulnerability, the fear. But then, just as quickly, the mask fell back into place. Her gaze hardened, and with a trembling hand she reached for the knife embedded in her side. I stepped back, breathing heavily, the room spinning around me. The journal lay on the floor between us, a damning testament to the horror she had wrought, But all I could focus on was the blood slowly pooling around Marlene's feet. She pulled the knife from her side with a wince, and I braced myself for another attack. But she simply clutched the wound, her strength waning. "You have no idea what you've done," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with venom. I didn't answer. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, but it wasn't enough to dull the realization of what had just happened. I had stabbed her, and despite everything she had done, the act felt surreal, wrong. But I couldn't let her distract me. I couldn't afford to let my guard down now, not with Marlene Davenport. She took a shaky step toward me, her movements unsteady but determined. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining her elegant dress a deep crimson, yet she continued to advance, her eyes never leaving mine. There was a cold, calculating determination in her gaze, and I knew that even wounded, she was still dangerous. I kept the knife raised, trying to force myself to stay focused. "It's over, Marlene. You can't get away with this." But she only smiled, a twisted, knowing grin. "You think you've won? You think this ends with me?" A shiver ran down my spine at her words. There was something in her tone, something ominous that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. But before I could press her, she staggered back, leaning against the desk for support. "You're too late, Detective," she continued, her voice growing weaker. "The truth, it's buried too deep. You'll never uncover it all." My mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. Was she bluffing, or was there more to this than I had uncovered? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, something that could unravel everything. But there was no time to dwell on it. I had to secure her, call for backup, and get her to a hospital if she would even make it that far. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. But before I could dial, Marlene's legs buckled and she collapsed to the floor. I rushed to her side, my instincts kicking in. Despite everything, I wasn't ready to let her die. Not like this, not without answers. "Marlene, stay with me," I urged, pressing my hand over the wound to stem the bleeding. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." But her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak. She looked up at me, her eyes unfocused, and I could see the life draining out of her. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening as if the very house itself was mourning her. With one final effort, she gripped my arm, her fingers cold and trembling. The key," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Use the key." Her hand fell limp, and with it the last of her strength left her body. Marlene Davenport, the Black Widow, was dead. For a moment I just knelt there, her lifeless body in my arms, the weight of everything crushing down on me. The key, the one Ellen had given me. Marlene's final words echoed in my mind, and I knew I had to find out what she meant. There was something more, something hidden that could be the final piece of this twisted puzzle. I gently laid Marlene's body down and stood, the room spinning around me as I tried to regain my focus. The journal was still there, its pages stained with blood. But I knew there was more to this than what was written inside. I had the key, but what did it unlock? My gaze shifted to the desk where Marlene had collapsed. There, behind the desk, partially obscured by shadows, was a small safe embedded in the wall. My heart skipped a beat. This had to be it. This was what Marlene was trying to protect, the secret she had killed to keep hidden. I approached the safe, my hands shaking as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key. The design on the safe's lock matched the intricate patterns on the key. My pulse quickened as I inserted the key into the lock, holding my breath as I turned it. The safe clicked open, revealing a small compartment inside. My eyes widened as I saw what lay within a stack of documents, bound together with a red ribbon. I pulled them out, my hands trembling with anticipation and dread. As I began to read through the papers, the full extent of Marlene's crimes unfolded before me. These were financial records, legal documents, and correspondences that detailed a vast network of corruption and murder. Marlene hadn't acted alone. She was part of something much larger, something that reached into the highest echelons of society. The men she had married, the men she had killed, they were all connected to this web of deceit and power. And at the center of it all was a name I hadn't encountered before, a mysterious organization called the Order of Aconite, the same poison that had killed Richard Davenport, the same poison that had been used in several of the other deaths. This was no coincidence. This was the signature of a group that operated in the shadows, pulling the strings behind the scenes. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. Marlene was just one player in a much larger game, and now I had stumbled upon the evidence that could bring the whole thing crashing down. But that also meant I was in more danger than ever. I quickly gathered the documents, slipping them into my coat pocket. I needed to get out of there to get these papers to the authorities before anyone realized what I had found. But as I turned to leave, I heard the faintest creak of a floorboard behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, expecting to see something. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty room. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I moved toward the door, every nerve on edge, when suddenly the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only sound the deafening silence pressing in from all sides. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for my flashlight, the small beam cutting through the darkness. As I swept the light across the room, I froze. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, tall and cloaked, its face obscured by darkness. The light barely touched it, as if it were a specter, an apparition born of the darkness itself. My heart raced as the figure took a step forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost gliding across the floor. I backed away, the document still clutched in my hand, knowing that I had to get out of there now. But the figure continued to advance, silent and relentless, as if drawn to me by some unseen force. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place by a terror I couldn't explain. Finally, I forced myself to move, turning and bolting for the door. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps silent but somehow echoing in my mind, as if it were chasing me through the very fabric of reality. I threw open the door and stumbled into the hallway, the cold air hitting me like a wall. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I ran through the darkened mansion, the shadows seeming to reach out for me, trying to pull me back into the abyss. The figure was still behind me, closing in, its presence like a weight on my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. I burst through the front door and into the night, the cold rain slashing against my face. I didn't care. I just kept running, the documents clutched tightly in my hand, my only lifeline in this nightmare. As I reached my car, I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I could still feel the figure behind me, watching, waiting. I finally managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling fingers. I looked up, expecting to see the figure standing there, but there was nothing, just the empty driveway and the darkened mansion looming in the distance. I didn't wait to find out if it was still inside. I started the car and sped away, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove through the rain-soaked streets, the city lights blurring as I raced toward safety. But even as I left the mansion behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still following me, that the shadows had come alive and were hunting me down. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this was far from over. The rain lashed against my windshield as I sped through the deserted streets, my thoughts racing faster than the car. The documents I had found in Marlene's safe weighed heavily in my coat pocket, a burning reminder that I was now entangled in something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. Marlene was dead, but her death was just the beginning of the nightmare. I had to get to Barnes. He was the only one I could trust with this. The shadowy figure that had chased me from Marlene Mansion was no hallucination, it was real, and it was after me. But why? What had I uncovered that made me such a target? The answers lay in the documents, and I knew we didn't have much time before the Order of Aconite realized what I had taken. I finally reached the police station, the familiar brick building offering a semblance of safety. I parked haphazardly in the lot and bolted inside, my soaked shoes squeaking on the polished floors. Barnes was at his desk, looking up with a start as I burst into the room. "Tom, what the hell happened?" he asked, his eyes widening as he took in my disheveled appearance. Barnes were in deep, I gasped, pulling the documents from my pocket and slamming them onto his desk. "Marlene wasn't working alone. There's a whole damn organization behind this, and they're coming after us." Barnes grabbed the papers, quickly scanning the pages, his face growing paler with every line he read. "Jesus, Tom, this is massive. This Order of Aconite, it's like a secret society, controlling everything from the shadows. If what's in these documents is true, they've got their hands in every major industry. Politics, finance, hell. They even have law enforcement in their pocket." "That's why we can't trust anyone else," I said, pacing the room, trying to shake off the lingering fear that clung to me. "We need to get these to the FBI, someone outside of their reach, but we have to be careful. Whoever was at Marlene's house, they weren't just there to scare me. They wanted these documents, and they're not going to stop until they get them." Barnes nodded, his jaw set in determination. "You're right, but we can't go to the FBI directly. We don't know how deep this thing goes. We'll need to find someone clean, someone we can trust." I was about to respond when the lights in the station flickered, casting the room in brief darkness. My heart skipped a beat, the image of that shadowy figure flashing in my mind. "What the hell?" Barnes muttered, glancing up at the ceiling as the lights flickered again, this time longer. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there before it was too late. "Barnes, we need to move now," I urged, grabbing the documents from his desk. But before we could take a step, the station was plunged into complete darkness. The only sound was the rain pounding on the windows, drowning out the sudden, suffocating silence. "Tom," Barnes began, but his voice trailed off as we both heard it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, slow and deliberate. I fumbled for my flashlight, but my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the empty corridor outside the office. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. "Who's there?" Barnes called out, his voice wavering with uncertainty. There was no response, just the relentless footsteps drawing nearer with each passing second. My breath hitched in my throat as I trained the flashlight on the doorway, the beam shaking as I held it up. And then the figure appeared. Cloaked in darkness, its face still obscured, it stood just beyond the threshold, watching us with an eerie stillness. I could feel its gaze, a cold, unnatural presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Get back!" Barnes shouted, drawing his weapon and aiming it at the figure. But it didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, as if it were waiting for something. I knew we had no choice. We had to run. I grabbed Barnes' arm and pulled him toward the back exit, the documents clutched tightly in my other hand. We bolted down the hallway, the figure's presence like a weight pressing down on us, making every step feel like a struggle. We burst through the back door and into the rain-soaked alley, the cold night air hitting us like a wall. But there was no relief, no sense of escape. The figure was behind us, its footsteps echoing in the alley, relentless and unyielding. "This way," I shouted, dragging Barnes toward my car. The rain pelted down on us, soaking us to the bone, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away, getting these documents to someone who could stop this madness. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with rain and sweat. Finally, the door unlocked, and we dove inside, slamming the doors shut. I started the engine, the car roaring to life, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing at the end of the alley watching us. "Go, go, go!" Barnes urged, his voice tinged with panic. I floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as we sped out of the alley and onto the main road. My heart pounded in my chest, the figure's presence still looming in my mind, a dark specter that refused to be shaken. But as we drove through the deserted streets, I realized something terrifying. The figure hadn't been trying to catch us, it had been driving us out, pushing us toward something, toward a trap. "Barnes," I said, my voice tight with dread, "we need to change our route. We're being herded." He looked at me, confusion and fear warring on his face. "What do you mean? Herded by who?" I didn't have time to explain. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the rain-slicked road. I yanked the wheel to the side, turning us down a narrow side street away from the main road. But as we rounded the corner, my worst fears were confirmed. Ahead of us, blocking the road, were two black SUVs, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The figure wasn't alone. The Order of Aconite was here. "Shit!" Barnes cursed, reaching for his gun. "We're trapped." I threw the car into reverse, but it was too late. Another SUV appeared behind us, boxing us in. We were surrounded. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I glanced at Barnes, my heart sinking as I realized there was only one option left. "We have to make a run for it," I said, my voice trembling. "They can't take us both if we split up." Barnes met my gaze, understanding dawning in his eyes. He nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. "Let's do it." We flung open the car doors and bolted into the darkness, the rain blinding us as we ran. I could hear the SUV doors slamming open behind us, the heavy thud of boots on pavement as they gave chase. But I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I ducked down an alley, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to keep going. The documents were still in my coat, and I clutched them tightly, knowing they were my only leverage, my only hope of getting out of this alive. But as I rounded another corner, my heart sank. Standing at the end of the alley, blocking my path, was another figure, cloaked and faceless. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving with exhaustion and fear. There was no escape. They had me. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. I backed away, my mind racing for a way out, but there was none. I was cornered. But then, something unexpected happened. The figure stopped, just a few feet away from me, and reached into its cloak. For a moment I braced myself, expecting a weapon, but instead it pulled out a small object, something shiny and metallic. It was another key. My breath caught in my throat as the figure held it out to me, its head tilting slightly as if to say, "Take it." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me not to trust this, not to trust them. But there was no other choice. I slowly reached out and took the key, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. As soon as I had the key, the figure stepped back, melting into the shadows like smoke. I was left standing there, the rain pouring down around me, clutching the key in one hand and the documents in the other. What was this? Some kind of twisted game? I didn't understand, but I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't afford to stop and think. I turned and ran, the key clutched tightly in my fist. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I had to believe it was important, maybe even the last piece of the puzzle. The Order of Aconite was after me, but now I had something they wanted, something they needed.